So you're curious if we have flooding in Nashville, Tennessee. Well, today we're going to talk all about flood zones. What are they? Where are they? What does that mean? Should we avoid them? Should we be scared? All that stuff. We're going to get into it today. It all starts right now. Hey, if this is your first time to the channel, I want to say thanks for stopping by. If you want to learn all about where to live in Nashville and what life is like here, then this channel's for you. You can subscribe and tap the bell for notifications so you can be the first to learn about the current market here in Nashville. Hey, my name is Clay with the Kelton Group. My partners, Tucker, Paul, the team, and I, we are contacted daily from people just like you, and you, about living in Nashville, and we love it. We are a real estate team here, and I've been an agent since 2004 and grew up in Middle Tennessee. And so we'd love to answer any questions you have. You can call us or email us or leave a comment. And remember, whether you're moving in 9 days or 90 days, we want to help you connect all the dots so you can make that right move. So I'm going to jump on my map so I can start showing you around. Let's get into it. So here we are on our Nashville map, and as you can see, there's a waterway, the Cumberland River, that goes right through the middle of downtown Nashville. And so, yeah, the question we get a lot, just being in the real estate business, is there flooding in Nashville? You know, people are coming from oftentimes other states where there's natural disasters are a huge deal, earthquakes, hurricanes, flooding, wildfires, all this stuff is happening out there. And the reality is in Nashville, we've had a few floods that have been significant and done damage. There was a really big one in 2010 that you'll often hear referenced in the real estate community because it was pretty bad. That's when the downtown Nashville flooded. The river, the Cumberland River, went over its banks. The Symphony had like 8 feet of water in it. Like the whole downtown had a bunch of water in it, and it was multiple feet. So that was pretty catastrophic, right? So that happened in 2010. That was the worst one that we've had in a really long time, definitely in my lifetime. Since then, there's been a few others, but not nearly as bad as that one. And so the reality is we don't have as many natural disasters as a lot of these other places. We do sometimes have tornado activity. There's a big tornado that hit East Nashville just a couple of years ago that did a ton of damage, and there is some tornado activity really up in this northeastern corridor. You don't see a ton down in the south, so it's not a big issue as far as natural disasters. That said, we do have flood zones that are federal flood zones, and they're kind of all over the place. So let me just give you an idea. You can see the map there. So now I just turned on the filter, and it's going to take a couple seconds probably to load up. And let's just see if we can give you a better idea of where the actual flood zones are in Middle Tennessee. So as you can see, all the purple is flood zone. And not to be alarming, but this is on the right over here. This is actually a lake. So yeah, this whole thing is a lake. It's technically a flood zone, but it's a lake. So yes, there's water there. And I will say this: these are the current designated flood zones. The thing with flood zones is that they can change. And so just because you're not in one today does not mean you may not be designated to be in one at some time in the future. They go through and they reassess things as conditions change and over the years. So one pro tip is to know which flood maps you're checking. If you're checking them, when were they last updated? Because they can change. And so I'm not, I have a really good idea where a lot of them are, but I don't know, they can change any given day. And so you always want to check and make sure you're looking at current data. So to give you kind of an idea, the interesting thing is that, in the real estate world, flood zones are one of those things that you tend to forget about and then you'll have a client that calls about a property, and oftentimes what happens is if you have a buyer client, they send over this property, and if it's a low area in general, then it's always top of mind to me to double check the flood maps. But a lot of times, if you're like, hey man, this price feels really good. This feels like it's $100,000 cheaper than anything else, or just it's a super fixed up house and it's a really attractive price. Well, sometimes there's a reason, and oftentimes it's because it might be in a flood zone. And so once you dig a little deeper and figure that out, the price makes more sense. So that happens to us all the time. I actually had a client recently, he kept, I was working with him for several months, and he kept sending me houses like, what about this house? What about that house? I think he sent me like 5 different ones, and every time it was flood zone. And I was like, you've got great taste. These houses are beautiful. There's just a little tiny asterisk that wouldn't be aware of at face value. And so sometimes that's just kind of the deal. And I will say in the last several years in the Nashville market, 2020, 2021, 2022, a hotter market, 2023, I've seen so many flood zone properties change hands because the market's been hot and people have been more motivated and maybe even more desperate sometimes to get a house. And so a lot of times, there's less options, and the flood zone properties become more interesting to our clients. So that's kind of a thing that can change with the market. So just switching over to a different mapping system that I like to look up flood zones on. It's just a better contrast, but you can see all the blue is all waterways and flood zones. And so what this amounts to is anywhere you have water, where does water flow to? It flows to the Cumberland River for the most part. And so you'll see what's interesting is all this stuff in downtown Nashville, anywhere near the Cumberland is like pretty, it's pretty likely to flood. And there's some really, I've sold a property over here off Mill Creek, which feeds into the Cumberland. Really neat property. It was a multi-acre property somewhere right through here, and you could, canoe access to the river, which was really, really cool. But part of that property was in a flood zone. Now, the house itself sits up higher, but the backyard was lower, and so this was like a 5 or 6 acre property. So the house was not in a flood zone, but we looked it all up, and it's just one of those things you want to check. And so this brings me to another point, like how do you know if you're in a flood zone? Well, a couple of different ways. If the property, and there's kind of a bunch of asterisks, but long story short, I'd try to always get in the habit of checking for flood zones when we're looking at properties before we write an offer or anything. I found one just a couple of days ago that was kind of over in the Creve Hall area, and it looked pretty good on paper. I was like, dude, let's just double check this. There's a creek behind it. Sure enough, property's in the flood zone. Let's not waste our time. The buyer wasn't interested in the flood zone in that case. So checking, real estate agents can check it very quickly if they're familiar with the mapping systems and some of the filters. So that's what I would recommend, is have your agent check for any property before you buy it, just to double check that it's not a flood zone. If a seller is aware that it's in a flood zone and the seller has lived there in the property, they're required to fill out the property condition disclosure. And if they're aware it's in a flood zone, they're supposed to disclose that. But what has happened, this has actually happened to me before, probably 10 years ago. The seller, I had a buyer, and the seller was not aware that they were in a flood zone. They didn't have a mortgage on the house. It was a paid off house, and at some point had been placed into the flood zone. The seller was not aware, so therefore didn't disclose. We were all surprised by it, and so we backed out of the deal or whatever. But the seller's not always the source. I mean, a lot of times you would think they would know, but unless you have a mortgage, and if you have a mortgage, most of the time your lender will force you to have flood insurance. And even if you get a mortgage when it's not a flood zone, if it becomes placed in a flood zone, a lot of those closing documents that you'll go through at the time of signing to close on the property will say, if this is placed in a flood zone, you agree to, pay for flood insurance. So that's part of the lenders, wanting to cover their investment. And so for most loans, you will see the lender will run a flood cert. That's flood certification, figure out if the property's in a flood zone. That's on most loans. Commercial loans even, I think typically, but always double check with your lender. But that's a common practice, is that they'll run that flood cert too, to double check. But I'm not sure that every single one of them does. So I think it's one of those things you got to be aware of and look for. And a lot of times, if the seller knows they're in a flood zone and they have a mortgage, they're already paying flood insurance. And how much is flood insurance? Well, it depends on which flood zone you're in, how bad it is, what the likelihood, the risk factor is of it flooding, as to what the rate would be. But I'll see quotes a lot of times that are $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a year. A couple $100 a month. It could be that much in a lot of these flood zones. Like, see all these houses right here? This is all flood zone. Gray bar. This is kind of the middle of Green Hills, lower area. These things are all flood zone. So you can see the little boxes. Another interesting thing that can come up is that sometimes the yard is flood zone, but the house itself is not. And that becomes here's a good one. Like, this house looks like it's not in the flood zone. Man, it looks close right there. But certainly the yard is. If it's just a yard, most lenders are not going to require flood insurance, but some of them, it's a lender by lender thing. And so we had one that was that exact case in West Nashville a couple years ago, where the yard was flood zone, the house didn't appear to be. Or actually, the house was in a very minor flood zone, and the lender did not require flood insurance. And so, you want to make sure you're working with a good quality lender that can give you a quick answer on that kind of thing, and you can figure out, that can run a flood cert for you. You can figure out, do I got to pay flood insurance if we buy this or not? But, these are all houses, these are all houses in the middle of Nashville. The crazy thing is, you'll be in an area where there's not a river anywhere nearby, and you're like, there's no way there's a flood zone right here. And sure enough, you'd be surprised. That some of these streets are like, hey, 1/3 of this neighborhood's in a flood zone, or like 1/10 of this neighborhood, just this one little section, is in a flood zone. So we see it a lot. But again, it's not like it's everywhere. So it's kind of like, unless you're it's on your radar from having worked in that area before, it's not always obvious, because they'll kind of creep up on you. For instance, here in the middle of Brentwood, you've got Meadow Lake, and gosh, you wouldn't believe it. You would drive through there and you'd be like, this does not feel like a flood zone kind of area in any way. But if the little Harpeth backs up enough, this is where the topography would lead to. And I don't think any of these have flooded back in here. I'm pretty familiar with this neighborhood, but yet there are some that are in the middle of the flood zone. So what happens if if a property is in a flood zone? How bad is it? We get asked this a lot, and my personal take on flood zones, there's pros and cons, right? So one pro might be it's the cheapest house in this area that's really hard to get into. Yes, it's a flood zone, but it's the only way I can get into this area if I'm just trying to break into a neighborhood. So that would be one pro for considering buying in a flood zone. It's like breaking into an area, barriers to entry. My thing is, if there's other options available and you have the time and patience to find one that's not in a flood zone, you're going to be probably a lot better off. So I tend to go away from them. The reason I don't like them is that flood insurance, it's a federal thing, and the price of flood insurance, it can change. It's been in Congress a bunch. Every few years they re-look at it, and there's just some political things there where if the flood insurance price changes, it's completely out of your control, and you may pay a lot more than you ever would have thought you'd have to pay to get flood insurance. So it's one of those things where it's not in your control. It's not like a safe, assumable number that's always going to be that current rate. So just to reiterate, the thing I don't like about flood insurance is that it's out of your control as to how much they charge for flood insurance, and there's a decent chance it could really change on you, and you have to be stuck paying it whatever they charge. So there's some regulatory issues with flood insurance that make it susceptible to potentially being a lot more expensive than it currently is, and I just don't like that unpredictable factor for clients. And so if you're considering it, my thought is, well, have you exhausted all your other options? The other reasons I don't love it, when you go to sell your property, it's going to be harder to sell, and it's going to probably take longer versus a house that does not have a flooded zone. So, that's my kind of words of wisdom. Now, I will say there's some properties that are in flood zones that are really awesome because they have a water feature in the backyard, or a river or creek, and it can be worth it, to the right person. But in general, I'm not a huge fan. My other thing is, every time it rains, you may have to think about it. You may have to think about, is my house going to flood as the water's rising? So, for instance, right here in the middle of Brentwood Country Club, the Little Harpeth River, it floods all the time. And you'll drive by and you'll see Brentwood Country Club's golf course just washed out. It's kind of crazy how often it happens a lot. It happens, I would say, almost every year now. Is the Little Harpeth gets over its banks, and so you only see, even in the country club, some of these, their yards are in the flood zone. And then, as you cross over, you've got some in Meadow Lake, on the backside of Meadow Lake here in Brentwood. These are all low. These got flooded in 2010. There was water in almost all these. And then as you go across Granny White, you have a couple of these big estate ones. This is a property I had some familiarity with. And look at this. See how this sits up, or it's not green? Well, that house has some kind of elevation certificate, and so what that means is that the crawl space may be in the flood zone, or the house may have been built up some. And so what you can do is, if your main house is not fully in the flood zone, but just your crawl space is, you can go get an elevation certificate, and they can reduce the amount of insurance that you have to pay, because your house is not at risk. It's just your crawl space at risk, in essence. So you get an elevation certificate is what that's called, and a surveyor can perform that, and they figure out how high, they'll put on there 18 inches before you're out of the flood zone and your crawl space kind of thing. Then you have, so you go across Granny White there. This is River Oaks. You got all these are in flood zone of River Oaks. This house right here is for sale again. I've seen this thing trade like 5 times. Busy street and flood zone. What else about flood zones? So other areas that you'll see, here's downtown Franklin. Again, the river runs through it, which is really cool. The Harpeth does. And then you see, like, man, this, I never would have guessed, like, there's all these houses over here that are, in the zone. So it's not always obvious. Here again, in Franklin, the neighborhood of Cottonwood, super popular neighborhood, family-friendly neighborhood, great spot. You got the Harpeth, which is a cool waterway, but you got some of this section of Cottonwood is all low. Now you see there's the .2 and then there's the AE. The .2 is not nearly as bad, and that's the one that it depends on, check with the lender, see if flood insurance is required. But you're going to be another neighborhood that people are often surprised to to learn. Of course, River Rest, you got some that have flooded through there. That's a neat little neighborhood on Hillsborough Road. But man, that river just gets wide once it gets above its banks. And then here's another neighborhood in Franklin, you know, the Fieldstone Farms, really big neighborhood. There's even some of the townhomes up front there. Not many people realize that these are flood zones. These are in the flood zone here. Some of them are not, some of them are. So again, I'm a fan of not being in it if you can potentially find other options. There's plenty of houses out there usually that are not going to be in it. Or if you do buy in it, you can expect a cheaper price, although your flood insurance cost, once you factor that in, are you really paying a cheaper price on a monthly basis, would be one way to look at it. But it's always going to be a negative, and you know, I know people whose houses have flooded. What's crazy is some of these houses in Wildwood up here in northern Brentwood. Let's see, where are we? So along here, these guys have gotten tired of getting flooded, and what you'll see now is some of these houses right here have literally put the house on jacks, raised it up 6 or 8 feet, put a new block around it, and the house is it's a ranch house, and it's now lifted up. Multiple people have done that right through here. It's cheaper than tearing the house down, and you know, took away a lot of the risk of being in the flood zone. So kind of interesting little. I've only seen that really in Wildwood. I haven't seen that a lot of other places yet. So just dropping into another area here, East Nashville. You know, here's downtown Nashville right here. As you go out, of course, the Cumberland does like kind of swoops around East Nashville into Inglewood, and most of East Nashville is fine. You know, not affected. There are a few streets, and they'll feel low when you drive through them. If you get really a feel for it, you'll realize they feel low. So Cooper's Creek, it's like it's affecting a few people. Artie, we've sold a few houses on Artie. It crosses over Artie. It hits some of these backyards, you know, right through there. A few of these guys are probably sitting in it. And so this is, and it goes all the way across. I mean, across Gallatin, probably like this is a long ways away from the Cumberland River. Once you're this far away, look at how far away that. I mean, that's crazy that you're still in it. Because that is, you know, that may be a 7 or 8 minute drive to get across there. Pennington Bend up here, Neely's Bend. A lot of this got hammered in the flood of 2010. And you know, and the other thing is, you don't necessarily have to be in a flood zone to get flood. You know, houses can flood whether they're in a flood zone or not. So you want to, you know, when you do your inspection, check for drainage. You know, figure out where the watershed's going to go and try to get ahead of it. So that's my deal with flood zones. Hopefully you found some of this valuable. If you learned anything or if you found any value in this, please give us a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe and check the bell for notifications. And remember, if you're moving in 9 days or 90 days, our goal is to help you connect all the dots so you can make that right move.